Hello, history lovers. I've had a request to talk about the history of monsters, and I really would love to do that for Halloween. Now, the problem with that is there's a lot of material to cover. There's a wide variety of monsters across different cultures. Even in Hollywood, you got everything from zombies to, giant reptiles like Godzilla. You've got all kinds of different monsters. Well, I decided to make two videos focusing on what I consider to be the main three classic monsters: the vampire, with particular focus on Dracula, but talking about vampires in general, werewolves, and the Frankenstein monster. So, for this video, I'm going to talk about the mythology of those three monsters before they ever made movies of them. For part two of this video, I'm going to talk about after the movies. So, let's get started with talking about vampires. Now, when you think of vampires, what do you think of? You might think of stakes through the heart, resistance to garlic, killed by sunlight. You know, um, so there's a lot of things that go along with the vampire mythology, but now a lot of them don't actually have anything to do with traditional vampires. A lot of that is purely the creation of Bram Stoker when he wrote Dracula.
Bram Stoker, a great Irish writer, is most famous for popularizing the more modern conception of the vampire with his depiction of Dracula. Making very tenuous connections to Vlad the Impaler, the reality is that Bram Stoker's Dracula was based almost entirely on Bram's own imagination.
Let's talk about the name Dracula for a moment. Now, it's common knowledge that there was a real person called Vlad Dracula who was a prince of Wallachia, and that his name inspired Bram Stoker. Now, there are stories that he had his victims impaled, political enemies, impaled, and that he collected their blood in bowls and dipped bread into it and ate that. So you can see the connection there. But now, the reason that Bram Stoker liked the name was that he'd heard Dracul was Romanian for devil. Actually, it can be translated as devil or dragon. You see, Vlad's father was Vlad Dracul, Vlad the dragon. And being his son, and proud to be his son, Vlad took the name Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon. La is just a way, it's basically like we would say junior. So, that's where the name Dracula comes from. However, in Romanian culture, everybody thinks of vampires being, Transylvanian, Romanian. They wouldn't have used the word vampire. If you could safely and honestly have a conversation with Dracula somehow and you would ask him, "Are you a vampire?" he would say, "No, I'm a strigoi." So, what exactly is a strigoi? Are they undead? Are they like we picture vampires? No, actually, strigoi are something a little bit different.
Strigoi does not only refer to an undead vampire, but also to a living witch or sorcerer, some of whom at least send out their spirits during the night to drink blood. Though most often associated with Romania, the Strigoi are also known in many other Romance languages. Striga in French refers to a bird woman who sucks blood. The Stragonine in Italian refers to a witch or sorcerer. Greek has Strix. The name is even found in Polish, which must have been borrowed from a Latin-based language.
Okay, so now we know a little bit more about the strigoi, which are the Romanian vampires and the source of a lot of the mythology that Bram Stoker built on. But now, what about the word vampire itself? Well, like a lot of the mythology of vampires, it's a blend from different cultures. Now, we talked about the Romanian, but of course, the idea of a vampire, of something that sucks your blood, is not limited to Romanian culture. And the word we use, vampire, has a lot of different origins as well.
Though the vampire may have had similarities to these other European undead beings, they also had their particularities. The Greek name for the vampire is Vrikolakas, but this is not Greek in origin but Slavic. But it doesn't actually mean vampire. Vrikolakas has the same origin as Volkolak. It means werewolf, not vampire.
There's actually a lot of connection between vampires and werewolves. And you can see there the word is used actually meaning werewolf. Now, Bram Stoker himself commented on the word having a double meaning when he has a character in his story, Jonathan Harker, overhear people talking about some evil in the area. He's not too good at understanding their language, so he doesn't quite get that they're talking about Dracula, but it does make a note of the different terms used.
I must say they were not cheering to me, for amongst them were Ordog, Satan, Pokol, Hell, Strigoika, Witch, Vrolok, and Vilkoslak, both of which mean the same thing, one being Slovak and the other Serbian, for something that is either werewolf or vampire.
Jonathan Harker makes a note that he's going to ask Dracula about these local superstitions when he sees him. If you've seen the Bela Lugosi movie, you know that Jonathan Harker here is turned into Remsfield. Now, they're actually two different characters in the book, but the movie kind of combines them. But yeah, he's going to go visit Dracula, and I'm sure nothing bad's gonna happen to him. Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, Dracula is the best known vampire story, of course. The first image anybody's going to think of when they think of Dracula is Bela Lugosi dressed as him from the movie version of the book. But now, Dracula is not the first vampire novel. Nope, that actually goes to a story called The Vampire. Now, interesting note there. You know how I said that there's a connection between vampires and werewolves? Well, there's also a connection between vampires and the Frankenstein's monster. Now, the first vampire story, The Vampire, creative title, right, was written by John William Polidori, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. Now, Polidori was a guest of Lord Byron at a castle during a stormy evening when Lord Byron suggested to everybody around, including Mary Shelley, who would later write who would end up writing Frankenstein, that they all try to come up with a scary story. Polidori's contribution, his entry in that contest, was The Vampire, and we all know what Mary Shelley wrote. Now, Bram Stoker did plagiarize a little bit from The Vampire. The idea of the vampire nobleman comes from that. In The Vampire, the main character is called Lord Ruthven. And again, you got the vampire nobility. You never hear a story about a vampire who's broke, do you? But the idea of the blood sucking from the neck, that comes from the vampire. But now, the idea of vampires not seeing their own reflection, that's purely Stoker's idea, because it was believed that if you didn't have a soul, you wouldn't have a reflection. And of course, vampires don't have souls, right? So, that is the pre-movie history of vampires. And of course, different movies put their own spin on it, and we'll talk about that in part 2. Now let's get talking about werewolves. Werewolves have a wide variety of origin stories. It's impossible to just pin one origin of the werewolf legend down.
Werewolf in Europe through their entrance into modern literature and pop culture. The first thing to understand about the history of the werewolf is that there is no single origin. Legend of these lupine shapeshifters are so numerous and widespread, their pervasiveness makes identifying one universal definition or origin of the wolf-human monster challenging.
So, one thing to understand, of course, there's a lot of different werewolf stories out there that predate movies. And of course, where you live depends on what kind of were animal we're talking about. There aren't just werewolves. If you're from India, there are were tigers. There are were panthers. There are were hyenas. There's, depending on where you live, there's all different kinds of stories of humans becoming animals. Now, a lot of the popular werewolf mythology we think of, the full moon, wolfsbane, a lot of those kind of things come more from werewolf movies, so I don't really have all that much to talk about with werewolves until we get to part two where I talk about movie werewolves. Because, a lot of our vampire mythology comes from Dracula, but that's, of course, a book that predates the movies. So, talking about werewolves before the movies, there's actually three different basic kinds of werewolves.
Wolves and humans are deeply ingrained in ancient literature and lore. These early stories seem to categorize werewolves into three different types. The victim, where an innocent person is cursed to turn into a wolf but maintains human reason. The damned, who are violent humans that become wolves as a punishment to both their body and soul. And the warrior, where humans take on the guise of the wolf to aid in success in battle.
Now, there's a very interesting story from ancient Greece about one of the damned kind of werewolves. King Lycan, yeah, there's a reason for that name. King Lycan thought it would be a funny idea to invite Zeus to dinner and to serve him human flesh. Now, the Greek gods did a lot of nasty stuff, but they were very, 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 very against cannibalism. And to try to trick one of the gods, there was no way this was going to end well for Lycan. Zeus knew right away that he was going to be tricked and said, okay, you think you can get away with this, you're going to be punished, and he turned Lycan into a wolf. Now, if you're familiar with werewolf stories at all, you know the word lycanthropy. Yeah, that's where we get that term. Lycan and anthropy are wolf, man-like. That's pretty much the same way we get the word werewolf. The old Anglican words were, man, wolf, werewolf, man, wolf.
Werewolf is a contraction of the Anglo-Saxon word were, which means man, and wolf, werewolf, man, wolf.
So how did you actually become a werewolf? Surprisingly, not by being bitten by a werewolf. That idea, pure Hollywood movie. If you go back to the really old traditional origins of the werewolf stories, it wasn't a bite that changed you.
As the werewolf legend spread, different cultures and geographic areas contributed their own unique flourishes, resulting in a staggering number of werewolf variations. Serbian legend says one becomes a werewolf if you drink water from the footprint of a wolf. Danish tradition dictates that only Danish men can become werewolves. Russian folk belief claims that a witch placing her girdle under a house's threshold on the inhabitants' wedding day will turn all who are celebrating into wolves once they cross over it.
So, you can see being bitten wasn't part of the werewolf mythology originally. But now, what about vampires? What about the Strigoi? How did you become one of them?
Might become a Strigoi in a number of ways, though through an unholy life, through improper burial practice, through a curse, and of course by having their blood sucked by another Strigoi in many cases, or by being killed or coming in contact with a Strigoi.
Speaking of ways to become these creatures, I did also want to talk about the warrior part of being a werewolf. There's 3 different types of werewolf. There's the victim, there's the damned, and there's the warrior. Well, the idea of a warrior werewolf comes from the berserkers. That's where we get our term going berserk. The berserkers were a group of Scandinavian warriors who believed that if they put on the skin of an animal, they would take on the characteristics of that animal. Now, this isn't quite the same idea as being a werewolf because you don't physically transform. However, there is definitely a mental transformation with these guys. When they went on the attack, you can see why we got the word berserk from them. They had no fear, didn't seem to react to pain, they just went for the attack. So, like I said, definite mental transformation with them. Now, we've talked about werewolves, talked about vampires. Okay, now, the last movie monster, the last of the 3 main monsters, I should say, I want to talk about is Frankenstein's monster. Now, this monster has the easiest history to trace. It comes from the book by Mary Shelley. Now, Mary Shelley herself has an incredible story of her own. And my first thought when I looked into her story, when I looked into how Frankenstein came to be written, was her story would make a great movie. Now, I've heard they're going to be making another movie of her, and there is a movie that was made in 2017 about her that's actually free to watch on Tubi. I haven't watched that yet, but I'm definitely going to be checking that out. Now, I do want to talk about her probably for next Halloween's video, because there's a lot to say about Mary Shelley herself. But I'm going to try to keep it as brief as I can, because like I said, this is going to be a whole nother video. But Mary Wollstonecraft, as she was originally, fell hard in love with Percy Shelley, who was a well-known poet. Now, Percy Shelley and Mary's father had very similar political ideologies. Very, 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 very progressive. Even by today's standards, they'd be considered progressives. And Mary fell hard in love with him, like I said, and they married after the death of his wife. And there's a whole nother story with that, but that's a subject for another video. They had a tragic start to their love life. Mary gave birth to a stillborn daughter. Very hard times. Well, their friend Lord Byron invited them to spend some time with him after they had been traveling. Now, on their travels throughout Europe, Mary heard of a certain scientist.
Now they made it to Calais. The whole trip was an adventure for them. Heading for a fashionable resort in Switzerland, they travelled along the Rhine, where they heard the strange story of Conrad Dippel, an anatomist who had dabbled in the dark arts.
Now, this particular scientist came from a place called Borg Frankenstein. That's where the name came from. But he wasn't the only scientist who influenced Mary Shelley. There was also a famous experiment done with electricity at the time.
The controversial anatomist Luigi Galvani had performed a famous public experiment which brought a new word into the language: to galvanize, to give life to.
Now, of course, we know that the dead cannot be brought back to life. But at that time, seeing a dead animal jerking and moving, it would have looked like life was restored at least for a few moments. And of course, that gave her the idea. Now, everybody probably knows the famous story. Mary, Percy Shelley, and some other friends were gathered together at Lord Byron's estate in Geneva. And they were sitting around and they got the idea, let's have a ghost story contest or a scary story contest. Now, that story kind of gives the impression that they all told those stories right on the spot that night. That isn't how it happened, but that was what gave the idea for a couple of different scary stories. Like I said, the first vampire book was written because of that night. Now, Mary didn't begin the story then and there. She actually had a nightmare that night about a scientist working over a dead body and trying to bring it back to life. That started her writing the book. The original book was published anonymously. It didn't even come with her name on it until 30 years later. Now, for most of us, when we think Frankenstein, we attribute that name to his creation. That isn't the case. Frankenstein is the name of the doctor who created this creature. And of course, when we think of Frankenstein, the first image that comes to mind is probably Boris Karloff, the flat-headed, green-skinned monster. Not at all like the book. So, the easiest way to explain the Frankenstein monster's origin is probably just to explain the original book. If you haven't read it, spoiler alert. So, this doctor, Victor Frankenstein, wanted to find a way to restore the dead to life. Contrary to in the movies, he didn't just use the body of one person. He basically stitched several bodies together and did his best to bring this thing to life. But now, this wasn't a case of, like in the movie, this creature was just lumbering around, stupid, acting on sheer brute force. No. This creation starts out as a complete blank slate. In other words, basically a baby. A very huge baby, but mentally a baby. Had Frankenstein treated this creature like a baby, could have turned out to be an ultimately good figure. But Frankenstein freaked out when he saw how this being looked. It was dead body parts brought to life. What do you expect? But the creature comes to him again later that night, trying to find some comfort. Like I said, basically a baby. Frankenstein drives the creature away, but now, like I said, this creature was extremely smart. Not at all like in the movies. He finds a cabin where this elderly gentleman is living with his son and daughter. Just by observing them and finding some abandoned books, he learns to speak and to read. And at a very high level. He finds Frankenstein's notebook in the jacket pocket that he'd taken when he fled Frankenstein's place, reads about his own creation. Well, he starts out trying to be good, and he figures, I'll do some favors for this family, show them I don't want to hurt anybody, I'm a nice guy. The father, the elderly man, was blind. Now, we see a lot of Frankenstein movies where the creature encounters a blind man. Well, this comes from the book. Only, like I said, this creature's smart, and he starts to do favors for the family. And he approaches the elderly blind man when the two children are out and says, Hey, I'm the guy who's done all this nice stuff for you. Please, when your children come, tell them I'm a friend. I'm not going to hurt you, I mean you well. Well, the blind guy's going to accept him, but the children come in, freak out, drive him away. Later, he comes across a young girl who's about to drown and rescues her, but everybody thinks he's trying to hurt her, and they actually take a shot at him. After that, it's a downward spiral of him saying, you know what, everybody thinks I'm evil, I'm gonna be evil then, forget it. And of course he wants revenge on Frankenstein. So, like I said, this guy taught himself to read and to speak through sheer observation in a matter of weeks. Extremely intelligent. So, vastly different from the movie, and the main purpose of the book, everybody seems to think it's science is bad. No, the point of the book was take responsibility. Had Frankenstein reacted with love to what he created, there's no end to the good that this creation could have done. It was because of what he did that led to all the tragedy. Now, I'm going to talk more about that when we get to the movies, but this winds up the background information before we get to the movies that were made of these three famous monsters. So I will see you in my next video. Take care and happy Halloween.